This is the first in a three-part series of videos comparing the classic Hurricane 3 with the sheet of the Hurricane 3 Neo, which is advertised as having a Neo powerful sponge and the Hurricane 3 top sheet. There are a variety of versions of these rubbers available in the world, but the versions I've used for testing were purchased by me in the UK and are the normal versions. In the second video, we'll look at how these rubbers compared in terms of rebound speed, throw height, reaction to incoming spin, and ability to generate spin. And in the third and final video, we'll look at how these rubbers performed when tested by 4 of our league members who have over 8 years experience between them. But in this video, we're concentrating on the physical appearance of the Hurricane 3 and the Hurricane 3 Neo. Out of the pack. The Neo comes in vacuum sealed packaging, whilst the standard Hurricane 3 comes in the usual cellophane packaging. Both the Neo and Hurricane 3 have clear tacky plastic films protecting the rubber's surface. However, the Neo also has a piece of white plastic backing sticking to the sponge. I'm not sure why DHS would do this, but in the past I've had factory tuned rubbers shrink back after I've removed them from the blade surface, so perhaps the backing on the Neo helps keep some tension in the sponge whilst in the packaging waiting to be sold. Both rubber sheets have what I would call a matte finish. Neither rubber has an obvious transparent look to them. Both rubbers have tacky surfaces which quickly attracted dust particles. The only real noticeable difference seems to be the rectangular box containing the ITTF authorised number for Hurricane 3, which ironically is only on the Neo sheet and which is listed as Hurricane 3 on the authorised list. 4. Weight and size. An uncut sheet of the Neo weighed in at 63 grams. An uncut sheet of the Hurricane 3 weighed 69 grams. These in my experience are heavy rubbers, and if you're thinking of using a setup with Hurricane on both sides of your blade, you'll need to take the relative weights of these rubbers into consideration, especially if you're already using a heavy blade. Although both these rubbers have Hurricane 3 in the title, the Neo version is cut smaller by DHS, measuring approximately 162mm by 162mm, compared to the Hurricane 3, which measured 165mm by 170mm. As the Hurricane 3 is larger than the Neo, this will go some way to explaining why the Hurricane 3 weighed more. Dome curl. The Neo had surprisingly little dome shape or curl to it. I wasn't expecting there to be much dome with Hurricane 3, as traditionally this was used for speed glue, which would have enhanced its performance. However, the Neo is described as having a powerful sponge, which I was expecting to mean it was factory tuned and tensioned. But when placed on the table, you can see both rubbers lie virtually flat. Sponge and pip structure. When looked at closely, the sponges appear very similar. Both feel quite hard when squeezed, although the Hurricane 3 felt the harder of the two. Flexing the rubber sheets showed the Hurricane 3 to feel the stiffer of the two, and there was a little more resistance when I tried to bend it. When I separated the rubber from the sponge, it was still difficult to see any differences between the Hurricane 3 and the Neo. However, when I tried stretching both sponges, the Neo had a more elastic feel and needed less effort to stretch it, whereas the Hurricane 3 sponge felt noticeably stiffer and harder to stretch. A visit to the one-of-a-kind table tennis shop's hardness table confirmed that the Hurricane 3 orange sponge version was indeed the harder of the two, measuring 44 compared to the Neo's 41. In the next demonstration, listen to the sound of the ball bouncing. The ball gives a noticeably higher pitch on the Hurricane 3, a clear sign that the Hurricane 3 has the harder sponge. A closer examination of the pip structure revealed they were similar in height and pattern, although strangely the Hurricane 3 pips did seem a little bigger. But with so little obvious difference between the top sheets in terms of appearance, having the same ITF number aside, I couldn't say from these tests whether or not the Hurricane 3 and the Neo used different top sheets. For the next series of tests, both rubbers were glued to a Stiga tube aluminium blade, which Stiga described as having an offensive rating. The rubbers were glued using butterfly free shack, and the blade surface has already been coated with jeweler blade varnish. Grip. To test their grip, I placed the tuning fork lightly on the surface of each rubber and rotated the blade round to see if I could complete a 360-degree turn without the tuning fork falling off. Whilst the Neo did well, not only could I do a 360-degree turn with the Hurricane 3, I could also keep on going and going and going. I'm not sure why the Hurricane 3 should do so much better than the Hurricane 3 Neo in the grip test, especially as they're supposed to be the same top surface. but there's no doubt that the Hurricane 3 has by far the best grip test results of any rubber I've tested. Tackiness test. By applying pressure to a table tennis ball and then using the tacky surface to lift the ball up, I compared how long the ball stayed stuck to the tacky surface of each rubber. Based on the results of the grip test, I was expecting to see the Hurricane 3 pick up the ball the longest, but while it did well, the Neo did much better. I can only put this down to the softer sponge of the Neo, which allowed the rubber surface to wrap around the ball more when the bat was pushed down onto the ball, unlike the grip test when no pressure was applied, so the sponge wouldn't have come into play. These two rubbers have by far the tackiest hold I've ever come across with any rubbers that I've tested. Caveat. However, be warned, as both these rubbers are tacky, you will need to keep them clean and protected when not in use. I repeated the tacky test again after filming the human testing for the third video in this test series. After 1 hour's continuous testing, notice the difference in their ability to pick up the ball. It's been significantly reduced. If you look closely at the rubber surface, you can see how the tacky surface in the centre of the blade has attracted a lot of dust off the ball. When I tried to pick up the ball using the edge of the blade, where less contact had been made with the ball in previous testing, the tackiness remained unaffected by any dust. So if you want to keep the tackiness on these rubbers, you're going to have to keep them clean and protected, and also be aware of the amount of dust on the floor at the venues you play at, because the ball is going to pick that dust up off the floor and put it on the tacky rubbers. Bounce test. Earlier I talked about the springiness or elastic feel of the sponges attached to these two rubbers. To test this further, I carried out a commonly used bounce test with the blade clamped horizontally in a vise and the ball dropped onto the surface of the rubber to see how high and often it would bounce. The ball bounced twice on the Hurricane 3, but took a small extra bounce with the Neo. I repeated this test, but this time with the tacky covers put back on. The bounce of the ball off both of the covered rubbers at this low speed is very similar. With the results being so similar, it suggests that the actual sponge of the Hurricane 3 Neo is really only going to come into play when there's power involved in a shot or speed from the ball. Conclusions. So bearing in mind the limits in the type of tests we can do, what conclusions can we make so far about the physical properties of the Hurricane 3 and the Hurricane 3 Neo? Well, both rubber top sheets appear very similar. Both are heavy. Both have by European rubber standards hard sponges, although the Hurricane 3 is the harder of the two. Both are very tacky, but the sponge of the Neo and the power in the ball will have an effect on the tackiness hold of the top sheet, with the Neo being the better of the two. Both have excellent grip, but this time it's the Hurricane 3 which wins. And the Neo sponge seems to be softer, more elastic and flexible in appearance. In part 2 we'll compare the Hurricane 3 and the Hurricane 3 Neo in terms of their rebound speed, throw height, reaction to incoming spin and their ability to generate spin. And in part 3 we'll look at what 4 of our experienced members thought of these two rubbers when they used them. Until then, thank you for watching.